Harlem, late 1960s. The streets glisten under the dim amber glow of streetlights. A soft drizzle has left the pavement wet, reflecting the neon signs of jazz clubs and corner bars. Somewhere in the distance, a saxophone moans through the night, carried by the damp breeze. Harlem is alive, buzzing, dangerous, and full of possibility, but tonight, something feels different. There's a stillness in the air, as if the city itself is holding its breath. Among the chaos of hustlers, gamblers, and small-time gangsters stands a man who does not belong to this noise. He is quiet, calm, almost regal in his posture. His suit is pressed perfectly, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He does not shout, he does not wave his arms, he does not need to. Men move out of his way, nodding respectfully as he passes. Women notice him, too, not just because he's handsome, but because of the gravity that seems to follow him. This is Frank Lucas, the man who will soon become the most powerful heroin kingpin in New York City. But unlike the loud, flashy gangsters who came before him, Lucas rules in silence. He is not a man of theatrics, he is a man of precision. He believes in strategy over noise, in control over chaos. And yet, behind that calm demeanor is a man who has seen violence, poverty, and death, and who has vowed to never be powerless again. The Harlem of this era is a place of contradictions. On one hand, it is a cultural jewel, the home of soul food restaurants, jazz music, and late-night block parties. On the other, it is a battlefield, where gangs fight over corners and the heroin trade is beginning to swallow entire communities. The Vietnam War is raging overseas, and young soldiers are coming home addicted to a new and dangerous drug. The streets are hungry for heroin, and someone is about to feed that hunger. Frank Lucas sees this hunger, and he sees an opportunity that no one else is bold enough to take. He is not just another street hustler, he is a visionary. He imagines a world where he no longer answers to anyone, not the Italian mafia, not the corrupt police, not the middlemen who control the drug trade. He wants to build something bigger, something that no one in Harlem has ever seen before, a drug empire that is clean, organized, and efficient, run like a Fortune 500 company. But to understand how he became the quiet king of Harlem, we must first understand the world that made him. We must travel back to his beginnings, to a dusty town in North Carolina, where a young boy learned that survival meant being clever, being strong, and sometimes being ruthless. Even in this introduction, Frank Lucas's legend looms large. People who knew him often described him with a strange mix of fear and admiration. Some saw him as a Robin Hood figure who brought money into the community, handing out turkeys on Thanksgiving, dressing well, giving Harlem a sense of pride. Others saw him as the man who unleashed a deadly wave of heroin that destroyed families and lives. The truth, as with most great crime stories, lies somewhere in between, and it is in that gray space that the real Frank Lucas lived. Picture the inside of a smoky Harlem nightclub in 1970. The bass from the band vibrates through the floor, drinks are being poured, dice are rolling in the back room. Lucas sits at a table near the center, a single drink in front of him, barely touched. He is watching, listening. Every deal, every argument, every slip of information filters through him like a chess master calculating his next move. He doesn't need to raise his voice to command respect, his reputation does the talking. And yet, for all his power, Lucas keeps a low profile. He avoids the flashiness that brought down gangsters before him. No flamboyant shootouts, no public murders, no gaudy headlines, at least, not in the beginning. He dresses sharply but conservatively, preferring custom suits that whisper sophistication rather than scream wealth. He is a shadow figure, gliding through Harlem's nightlife with an eerie calm. What makes Lucas fascinating is not just that he became rich and powerful, many criminals have done that, but how he did it. His plan was unlike anything the mafia had ever seen. He cut out the middlemen, went straight to the source, and brought back heroin so pure that it redefined the drug game. It was brilliant, dangerous, and, for a time, unstoppable. But what happens when a man builds an empire on silence? When he trusts no one but family, when he becomes the most powerful man in Harlem but cannot sleep without looking over his shoulder. The rise of Frank Lucas is a story of ambition, but also of paranoia. It is a story where loyalty and betrayal are constantly at war. As this story unfolds, we will trace Frank Lucas's life from the red dirt roads of LaGrange, North Carolina, to the glittering nightclubs of New York City, from his early days as a small-time hustler to his peak as the heroin kingpin who flooded the streets with a product called Blue Magic. We will sit with him at the height of his power, and we will walk with him into the courtroom where he faced the consequences of his empire. And when it is all over, when the last deal has been made and the last dollar counted, we will stand at his grave and wonder what it all meant. Was Frank Lucas a villain, a genius, or simply a man who played the only game he thought he could win? This is the story of Frank Lucas. And it begins, quietly, under the Harlem streetlights. The story of Frank Lucas truly begins far from the neon lights of Harlem, in a small, dusty town in North Carolina called LaGrange. Life here was simple but harsh, and for young Frank, it was a world defined by poverty, segregation, and survival. The field stretched endlessly, and most of the children in the community grew up knowing that their future was already decided for them: farm work, factory work, or some other form of labor that barely kept food on the table. But Frank Lucas was never like the others. Even as a boy, he carried a restlessness inside him, a quiet sense that he was destined for something more, though he could not yet name what it was. His family was poor, living in a small wooden house that creaked with every breeze, the kind where you could see daylight between the boards. His parents did what they could, but money was scarce, and there were many nights when dinner was little more than cornbread and beans. Frank would often sit on the porch in the humid southern air, staring out at the dirt road and thinking about what might lie beyond the horizon. He would later say that he knew, even as a child, that he wanted to escape, to leave LaGrange behind and find a place where he could control his own destiny. But poverty was not the only thing shaping him in those years. The South of the 1940s was a place of deep racial tension. Black children were taught to keep their heads down, to stay out of trouble, to survive by avoiding confrontation with the white world that surrounded them. Frank remembered moments of humiliation, of being treated as less than human, and each memory burned itself into him like a brand. He swore that one day he would rise so high that no one could ever look down on him again. The defining moment of his young life came in the most tragic way possible. Frank would tell the story many times later, though details sometimes shifted, as memories do over the years. He said that one day, when he was still a teenager, he saw his cousin killed, shot dead by members of the Ku Klux Klan over a trivial dispute. The image never left him, the sound of the gun, the sight of blood in the dust, the casual cruelty with which it was done. For Frank, that day became a turning point. It was no longer enough to simply dream of escape. Now it was a matter of survival, of revenge, of power. He promised himself that he would never again allow himself or his family to be so powerless. In the months that followed, Frank became bolder. He began to run small hustles around town, stealing food, selling what he could, doing whatever was necessary to bring in a little extra money. There was a sharpness in him that others began to notice. He had a gift for reading people, for knowing who could be pushed, who could be tricked, and who should be left alone. The other kids might get caught and punished, but Frank always seemed to slip away, vanishing just before trouble arrived. It was as though he was already practicing for a life on the run, learning how to stay one step ahead. But LaGrange could not contain him forever. The town was too small, the opportunities too few, the air too heavy with the weight of his memories. Frank's thoughts turned constantly toward the north, to the cities he heard about in stories, where money could be made and a man could reinvent himself. He imagined New York, the lights, the music, the endless possibilities. To him, Harlem was not just a place, it was a promise, a doorway to a life he could not have in the South. Before long, he made the decision that would change his life: he would leave LaGrange behind. He would take a bus north and start over. It was not an easy choice. He loved his family, and he knew the danger of striking out on his own, but something inside him told him that if he stayed, he would either end up dead or trapped in the same cycle of poverty that had claimed so many others. Leaving was his only chance. On the day he left, the sun was beating down hot on the red dirt road. He carried little with him, just a few belongings and the determination to make something of himself. As the bus pulled away, Frank looked back one last time at the place that had shaped him. In that moment, he felt both fear and excitement. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was his. Whatever waited for him in New York, he would face it on his own terms. Years later, when he was asked about that time in his life, Frank Lucas would say that the South had given him two things, pain and purpose. The pain of seeing injustice and death had hardened him, had made him willing to do whatever it took to rise above it. But it had also given him purpose, a mission to seize power, to control his own fate, and to make sure no one could ever take anything from him again. That mission would guide him through every decision he made, leading him first to Harlem streets and eventually to the top of the drug trade. The boy who left La Grange was not yet the man he would become, but the seed had been planted. Somewhere deep inside him, the Kingpin was already forming. And as the bus rolled north, carrying him farther from the fields of his childhood, Frank Lucas allowed himself a small smile. The world did not know his name yet, but it would. When Frank Lucas arrived in New York City, it was like stepping onto a different planet. The noise, the lights, the endless flow of people, it was overwhelming at first, but also intoxicating. For a boy from La Grange, Harlem was everything he had imagined and more. The streets pulsed with life, with opportunity, with danger. There were vendors calling out on street corners, music spilling from open doors, and the constant murmur of voices that seemed to say, if you're clever enough, if you're strong enough, you can make something of yourself here. At first, Lucas had very little. He had no real job, no friends, no one to rely on. He took whatever work he could find, sweeping floors, carrying crates, running errands for small-time hustlers. Each day was a test of survival, but also a lesson. Harlem taught quickly, and it taught hard. Lucas watched everything and everyone, studying how the hustlers talked, how they moved, how they made money. He paid close attention to the men who seemed to command respect, the gamblers, the loan sharks, the small gang leaders, and he asked himself what made them different from the men who ended up broke, beaten, or dead. The streets in those days were ruled by a mix of black gangsters and Italian mobsters. Lucas saw the hierarchy right away. The Italians had the power, they controlled much of the numbers racket, the drugs, and the major criminal enterprises. The black hustlers, for the most part, were allowed to operate, but only so long as they paid tribute to the mafia. Lucas filed this away in his mind. If he wanted to be more than just a corner hustler, he would need to understand not just the street game but the larger forces behind it. His first real crimes were small, almost harmless compared to what would come later, pickpocketing, shoplifting, running cons. But he had a talent for it. He was quick, smooth-talking, and fearless. If he was caught, he could talk his way out of trouble, or at least out of a serious beating. If he wasn't caught, he learned something about how far he could go. Each crime was like a stepping stone, a small risk that led to bigger risks. There was one incident that stood out in Lucas's memory for the rest of his life. He had tried to rob a man, a hustler with a reputation, and nearly got himself killed. The man cornered him in an alley and put a gun to his head. Lucas thought he was finished, but something about the way he carried himself, about the way he refused to beg, made the man pause. Instead of pulling the trigger, the hustler laughed and told him he had guts. That night, Lucas learned a lesson he would never forget: in Harlem, fear could kill you, but courage could earn you respect. As the months passed, Lucas began to carve out a place for himself. He became known as reliable, someone who could get things done. If a man needed a package delivered, Lucas would deliver it. If someone needed a lookout, he would stand watch. Slowly, he started to move up, gaining the attention of bigger players. This was where his natural charisma really began to show. He had a way of talking to people, making them feel like he understood them, like they could trust him. It was around this time that Lucas first heard the name Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson spoken with a kind of reverence. Bumpy was the undisputed boss of Harlem, a man who had brokered peace with the mafia and kept the streets under a kind of order. Lucas was fascinated by him, though he had never seen him up close. To Lucas, Bumpy represented everything he wanted to be: powerful, respected, untouchable. But Lucas was still far from the inner circle. He had to prove himself, to show that he was more than just another kid running scams. The chance came one night outside a nightclub. There had been a fight, a dispute over money that was about to turn deadly. Lucas stepped in, calming the situation, keeping a man from being stabbed. The incident was small, but word traveled fast, and soon Lucas was being noticed by men who had connections to Bumpy himself. Lucas would later say that those early days in Harlem were like an education. The streets were his school, and survival was his degree. He learned when to speak and when to stay silent, when to run and when to stand his ground. Most importantly, he learned patience. The money was tempting, but he understood that rushing could get him killed. If he wanted to be someone, really someone, he would have to wait for the right moment. At night, when he was alone, Lucas would sometimes walk the length of 125th Street, watching the lights of the Apollo Theater, listening to the music pouring out of the clubs, and thinking about the future. He knew that he could not stay small forever. Something inside him pushed him forward, whispering that the city was his if he was willing to take it. That ambition burned in him, even as he struggled to stay afloat. He had no idea that fate was about to intervene, that a single meeting would change the course of his life. For in the near future, Lucas would find himself face to face with Bumpy Johnson, the man who would teach him the rules of power and set him on the path to becoming the quiet king of Harlem. The first time Frank Lucas saw Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson up close, it was like watching a king walk through his kingdom. Harlem seemed to bend around Bumpy, the crowd parting as though moved by an unseen wind. He wasn't the biggest man, nor the loudest, but there was something about his presence that commanded silence. People nodded respectfully as he passed, some tipping their hats, some avoiding his eyes altogether. Lucas stood at a distance, just another face in the crowd, but inside he felt something shift. This was the man he had been hearing about for months, the man who kept Harlem running like a well-oiled machine. Bumpy Johnson had a reputation that stretched beyond Harlem. He was part street philosopher, part gangster, part diplomat. He had done time in Alcatraz, rubbed shoulders with famous writers and musicians, and yet remained fiercely devoted to the neighborhood. To the Italian mob, he was a trusted partner; to Harlem, he was its protector. And now, somehow, Frank Lucas had caught his attention. The moment came late one night when Lucas was hanging around outside a club, half working, half watching the door. There was a commotion, a scuffle between two men that was about to turn violent. Lucas, without thinking, stepped in and broke it up before it escalated. What he didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson himself was inside that club, and one of the men involved worked for him. The next day, Lucas was summoned, and that was the beginning of everything. He was nervous when he walked into the restaurant where Bumpy held court. The room was filled with smoke, the low murmur of conversation, and the faint clinking of glasses. Bumpy sat at a table near the back, dressed sharply but simply, a hat resting on the chair beside him. When he looked up, his gaze was sharp, assessing, as if he could read Lucas's entire life just by studying his face. "You got heart," Bumpy said after a long pause. "Not too smart, stepping in like that, but heart." For Lucas, those words were like being knighted. From that day on, he was in. At first, he was just a driver, a bodyguard, an errand runner. But those jobs gave him access to Bumpy's world. He drove him across Harlem, to meetings with politicians, to sit-downs with Italian mob bosses, to charity events where Bumpy donated turkeys to poor families. Lucas watched everything. He listened when Bumpy talked business, when he gave orders, when he negotiated peace between rival crews. He saw how Bumpy balanced kindness with ruthlessness, how he could be charming one moment and terrifying the next. Bumpy believed in teaching by example. He would lean back in the car seat and talk to Lucas in a calm, measured voice, sharing lessons about power, loyalty, and survival. "Don't ever let them see you sweat," he told him once. "You lose your temper, you lose the game. A man who stays cool stays alive." Lucas soaked it all in. Harlem became his classroom, and Bumpy Johnson his professor. He learned that money wasn't everything, respect was. He learned that if you kept the police paid, if you kept the Italian bosses happy, if you kept the community fed, you could run things without constant bloodshed. He learned that violence was a tool, not a habit, something to be used rarely, surgically, when there was no other option. There were moments when Lucas saw just how powerful Bumpy was. Once, he watched as a man tried to shortchange Bumpy during a deal. Bumpy said nothing at first, just stared at him with those cold, intelligent eyes. Then, with a suddenness that shocked everyone, he slapped the man across the face. "You don't disrespect me," Bumpy said quietly, and the man stammered out an apology. The money was paid in full. Lucas never forgot that moment. Power didn't have to be shouted, sometimes it was whispered. The more time he spent with Bumpy, the more Lucas began to understand the larger game being played. The Italians might have had the connections and the supply lines, but Bumpy had Harlem's loyalty. He was the bridge between two worlds, and in that space, he had carved out an empire. Lucas admired him deeply, not just for his power but for his discipline. Here was a man who had survived decades in a business that killed most men before they reached 40. Over time, Bumpy began to trust Lucas. With more responsibility. He sent him to collect payments, to deliver messages, even to sit in on low-level meetings. Lucas never made a scene, never drew attention to himself. He dressed well, spoke softly, and did what he was told. And Bumpy noticed. One night, after a particularly tense meeting with a rival crew, Bumpy and Lucas sat in the car in silence for a long while. Finally, Bumpy turned to him and said, "You got potential, Frank. But potential don't mean nothing unless you use it right. You keep your head straight, keep your nose clean, and one day, you might run something yourself." Those words burned into Lucas's mind. He could feel the future stretching out in front of him, waiting to be claimed. He had found not just a mentor, but a model, a man who showed him that you could be both feared and respected, that you could hold power without losing your soul. But even as Lucas rose in Bumpy's world, he understood that nothing lasted forever. The streets were always changing, always shifting. Rivals were waiting for their chance, and enemies could appear overnight. Lucas didn't know it yet, but the day would come when Bumpy Johnson would no longer be there to guide him, and on that day, Lucas would have to decide what kind of man he would become. The night Bumpy Johnson died, Harlem felt different. The man who had kept the streets in balance for decades was gone, and the news spread faster than the sound of a police siren. It happened quietly, without the violence that so often marked the end of gangsters. Bumpy collapsed while eating a plate of fried chicken at Wells' restaurant, his favorite spot. The great king of Harlem, who had survived Alcatraz, mob wars, and endless battles on the streets, was felled not by a bullet but by a heart attack. Frank Lucas was one of the first to hear. He rushed to the restaurant, pushing through the crowd that had already gathered outside. Inside, the air smelled of grease and smoke, but there was no laughter, no chatter, only the quiet murmur of shock. Lucas saw Bumpy lying still, the life gone from his eyes, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt. This was the man who had taught him everything, who had shown him the blueprint for power. Now, that blueprint lay unfinished. The funeral was massive. Hundreds turned out to pay their respects, politicians, musicians, street hustlers, ordinary neighbors. Harlem mourned its king. Lucas stood by the casket, dressed in a dark suit, his face unreadable. He shook hands, accepted condolences, but inside, his mind was racing. He knew what Bumpy's death meant, a power vacuum. And in Harlem, a vacuum never lasted long. Within days, the cracks began to show. Rival gangs started pushing harder for control. The Italian mob made moves to tighten their grip on the numbers racket. Police, no longer wary of Bumpy's influence, became bolder in their shakedowns. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see who would step forward. For Lucas, the question was personal. He could have faded into the background, kept his head down, taken a job with one of the other bosses. Many expected him to do just that. After all, he had been Bumpy's driver, his bodyguard, his protégé, not his heir. But Lucas had been watching, listening, learning. He had not just driven Bumpy around Harlem, he had absorbed his philosophy, his strategy, his discipline. And now, standing in a Harlem that was threatening to descend into chaos, Lucas made a decision that would change the course of his life. He would take the throne. But he would do it differently. Lucas had seen the pitfalls of the old ways, the flashy violence, the constant wars that drew too much attention. He would build something smarter, something cleaner. He would create a drug empire that cut out the middlemen, that operated with precision, like a corporation. And he would do it so quietly that no one would realize how big he had become until it was too late. Still, it was a dangerous gamble. The Italians controlled most of the heroin coming into Harlem, and they were not in the habit of letting outsiders disrupt their business. If Lucas was going to succeed, he needed to find a way around them. He needed his own supply, one that was cheaper, purer, and completely under his control. The thought became an obsession. Lucas spent long nights pacing the floor of his apartment, thinking, planning, remembering the lessons Bumpy had taught him. He thought about the community, about the money that flowed through Harlem and into the pockets of outsiders. He thought about respect, how true power came not from fear but from control. There were moments when doubt crept in. Lucas knew the risks. If he failed, he would end up dead or in prison, just another name on a long list of men who had tried and failed to rule Harlem. But then he would remember that night at the restaurant, the sight of Bumpy lying on the floor, the silence that followed. Someone had to step up. Someone had to fill the void. And who better than the man who had been at Bumpy's side, who had learned from him every day, who had already seen how the game was played? In the weeks after the funeral, Lucas began making moves. Quietly, carefully, he reached out to contacts, feeling out who could be trusted. He gathered his brothers and cousins from North Carolina, bringing them to New York one by one. Family, he believed, was the only loyalty he could count on. Together, they formed the skeleton of what would soon become a powerful organization. The streets noticed. People began whispering that Frank Lucas was stepping up, that he was putting together something big. But there was no open war, no dramatic shootouts. Lucas made sure of that. He wanted the takeover to feel natural, inevitable, as if Harlem had simply chosen its next king. When Lucas finally looked around and saw that the pieces were in place, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The boy from La Grange, the driver, the bodyguard, all of that was behind him now. He was no longer just Bumpy Johnson's protégé. He was ready to build his own empire. But to do it, he would have to take the next step, the boldest move of his life, and find a way to bring heroin into Harlem on his own terms. And that decision would lead him halfway around the world, to a place where few gangsters had dared to go, to a plan so dangerous and so brilliant that it would make him one of the most powerful drug lords in American history. Frank Lucas knew that if he wanted to rule Harlem, he couldn't keep buying heroin through the Italian mob. That was how everyone else did it, and that was why everyone else stayed small. The Italians controlled the supply, they controlled the price, and they kept the best product for themselves. Lucas wanted more than scraps. He wanted to build something that no one could touch. To do that, he needed to cut out every middleman, every extra hand taking a slice of his profit. He needed to go directly to the source. That thought became an obsession. Lucas spent hours sitting in the dim light of his apartment, maps spread out on the table, magazines and news articles scattered around him. The Vietnam War was raging, and he kept hearing stories about soldiers coming home addicted to heroin. The demand was exploding, and the supply coming into New York was diluted, stepped on by the time it hit the streets. If he could find a way to bring in heroin that was purer and cheaper, he could undercut every competitor and build a monopoly. But this wasn't a dream for the faint of heart. The source meant traveling to the most dangerous part of the world at the time, the Golden Triangle, where the borders of Thailand, Laos, and Burma met. It was remote, lawless, and crawling with both warlords and soldiers. Few Americans had any business being there, let alone a black man from Harlem with dreams of becoming the biggest heroin trafficker in the United States. Lucas, however, was not afraid. He had learned from Bumpy Johnson that fortune favored the bold, and he believed this was the kind of bold move that would set him apart. Through a series of contacts, some in Harlem, some overseas, he learned of a man who could help, Leslie Ike Atkinson, a former U.S. Army sergeant stationed in Southeast Asia. Atkinson was savvy, well-connected, and he knew how things worked on the ground. Most importantly, he had access to the military's vast network of planes and supply lines, which moved back and forth between Asia and the United States every day. Lucas flew to Bangkok, his first time leaving the country, and it was like stepping into another world. The heat hit him first, thick, humid, and unrelenting. The streets were alive with the noise of motorcycles, street vendors, and soldiers from half a dozen countries. Lucas kept his head down, taking it all in, careful not to draw attention. Atkinson met him there, and the two men talked long into the night in a quiet hotel room. The plan they formed was simple in concept, daring in execution. Lucas would buy heroin directly from the source, from producers in the mountains of the Golden Triangle, at a price that was a fraction of what the Italians paid. The product would be nearly pure, 98 to 100%, something unheard of on the streets of New York. Once purchased, the heroin would be smuggled back to the United States using the military's own supply chain, hidden in false compartments in the coffins of dead soldiers or in the cargo holds of military planes. It was a plan that combined opportunity with chilling pragmatism. The war had created chaos, and chaos was good for business. The U.S. military presence provided cover, the jungles provided the product, and the corruption of local officials meant that, for the right price, anything could move across borders. Lucas traveled deep into the mountains with Atkinson, meeting the producers face to face. The journey was dangerous, narrow dirt roads, armed escorts, the constant threat of ambush. But Lucas was calm. He had always been calm, even under pressure, and that calm impressed the men he was dealing with. They saw that he was serious, that he wasn't just another small-time hustler looking to make a quick score. He was a businessman. When the first deal was struck, Lucas felt something close to triumph. He had done what no one in Harlem had ever done. He had secured a direct line to the purest heroin in the world. It was a moment that would change the trajectory of his life, and in that moment he felt the weight of destiny pressing down on him. He was no longer just a player in someone else's game. He was about to rewrite the rules. The first shipments went smoothly. When the product hit the streets of New York, the effect was immediate. Dealers couldn't believe the quality, it was stronger, cleaner, and cheaper than anything else available. Lucas named it Blue Magic, a brand that soon became famous, and feared, throughout Harlem. It was more than just a drug, it was a promise of consistency, of reliability. People lined up to buy it, and the money began to pour in. Lucas returned from Asia with a new confidence. He had done the impossible and gotten away with it. Now he had something that no one else could match, and he intended to keep it that way. But he also knew that success would bring attention, from the Italians, from the police, from anyone who realized that someone new was moving product on a scale Harlem had never seen before. At night, sitting in his New Jersey home, Lucas would think back to the mountains, to the jungle roads, to the calm faces of the men who had sold him his first kilo. The risk had been enormous, but the reward was even greater. He had cut out the middleman, just as he had always dreamed. He was on his way to building an empire, one that would make him rich beyond his wildest dreams, and one that would eventually make him a target for some of the most powerful forces in America. When the first bricks of heroin from the Golden Triangle hit the streets of Harlem, it was like striking a match in a room full of gasoline. The product was different, cleaner, purer, stronger, and the word spread fast. Dealers were astonished by its potency. Addicts could tell immediately that this was no ordinary dope. It didn't just get you high, it knocked you back, smooth and powerful, like nothing they had ever felt. Frank Lucas had done what no one else had dared to do, and now he was reaping the rewards. He called it blue magic. It was a name chosen with care, simple and elegant, the kind of name that stuck in your head. Lucas understood branding long before most gangsters did. Blue magic wasn't just a product, it was a promise. Every bag would be the same quality, the same strength. It was heroin treated like a luxury good, consistent and reliable. People trusted it, and that trust turned into loyalty. Very quickly, Harlem became the center of a quiet revolution. Dealers who had been struggling to move weak, diluted product now had something that practically sold itself. The money began to flow like a river, faster, thicker, and in greater amounts than Lucas had ever imagined. Each day brought in more profit, each night the stacks of cash grew higher. Lucas and his crew would sit at his house in Teaneck, New Jersey, counting money for hours, the bills stacked so high they had to use clotheslines to dry them when they got damp from handling. But Lucas's brilliance wasn't just in the quality of his heroin. It was in the way he ran his operation. He treated it like a business, like a corporation. There were rules, structure, discipline. No one was allowed to get high on their own supply. No one was allowed to draw unnecessary attention. Everything was about efficiency, about keeping the machine running smoothly. He employed his brothers and cousins, keeping the business in the family, trusting blood over outsiders. And Harlem noticed. The streets became strangely calm under Lucas's rule. Where other dealers fought bloody turf wars, Lucas kept order. Violence was bad for business, and he made it clear that anyone who caused trouble would be cut off. He had the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to shout. A word from Lucas was enough to settle disputes. People respected him, even feared him, but it was a controlled, measured fear. At the same time, Lucas began to enjoy the fruits of his empire. He was making more money than he had ever dreamed possible, and though he avoided the flamboyant style of some gangsters, he allowed himself certain luxuries. Custom-tailored suits, handmade shoes, expensive watches. He drove fine cars and bought a sprawling mansion in Teaneck, where he held barbecues for his family and crew. It wasn't about showing off, at least not at first. It was about proving to himself that he had escaped the poverty of LaGrange, that he had built something lasting. There was one night, early in his reign, when Lucas stood on a Harlem street corner and simply watched the flow of business. Dealers working, money changing hands, customers leaving satisfied, all of it orchestrated by him, all of it feeding his growing fortune. For a moment, he felt a kind of peace. He had done what he set out to do. He had built his empire. But with great success came great risk. The more money he made, the more attention he drew. Rival dealers resented his monopoly. The Italian mob began to suspect that someone had found a way to bypass them, and that made them uneasy. And then there were the police, some of whom wanted a piece of the action, others who simply wanted to take him down. Lucas knew that the higher he climbed, the more dangerous the game became. Still, he could not slow down. The demand for blue magic was insatiable, and he kept the supply coming, shipment after shipment from Southeast Asia. Each time a new load arrived safely, he felt the same rush of triumph. He was playing a game with the entire system, the police, the mob, the government, and winning. Yet even as the empire grew, Lucas remained careful about his image. He didn't frequent nightclubs as often as others in his position might have. He didn't get into public shootouts or splashy fights. He dressed well, but he kept his profile low. He wanted to be respected as a businessman, not feared as a thug. This careful balance, of power, of image, of control, was what allowed Lucas to stay on top longer than most. He was not just another dealer. He was a visionary, a man who had turned a street hustle into an empire that rivaled the mafias. But there were cracks beginning to form beneath the surface. For all his discipline, Lucas was still human, and the temptation to indulge was always there. He began to trust the wrong people, to expand too fast, to believe that he was untouchable. And all the while, somewhere in the background, the law was beginning to take notice. For now, though, Lucas stood at the peak of his power, the quiet king of Harlem, with a product that dominated the streets and a fortune growing by the day. The streets buzzed with the name Blue Magic, whispered like a secret and spoken like a prayer. And Lucas, watching from the shadows, knew that he had done something extraordinary, something that no one could take from him. Or so he thought. Frank Lucas believed in one thing above almost everything else: loyalty. In his mind, loyalty was rarer than gold, rarer than diamonds. It couldn't be bought, it couldn't be faked, and once broken, it was gone forever. That was why, when the time came to build his empire, Lucas turned not to the street hustlers of Harlem, not to ambitious outsiders, but to the people he trusted most, his own blood. One by one, he brought them north. Brothers, cousins, nephews, he called them out of North Carolina and into the heart of Harlem. Some had been farmers, some truck drivers, some had never left the small towns they were born in. For many, this was their first taste of the big city, and it was dizzying. But Lucas had a plan. He trained them himself, teaching them the rules of the business, drilling into them the importance of discipline and secrecy. He gave them specific jobs: some handled shipments, some counted money, some oversaw distribution. Each man had a role, and each role was critical. Lucas made sure everyone knew that this wasn't just a hustle, it was an organization, a business that had to be run with military precision. "We're not street corner hustlers," he would remind them. "We're running something bigger than that. Act like it." The atmosphere in Harlem began to change as the family took over. The Lucas brothers became a presence, not loud, not flashy, but unmistakable. They moved through the streets with quiet confidence, overseeing operations, making sure every bag of blue magic was exactly what it was supposed to be. Dealers learned quickly that if you worked for Lucas, you followed the rules. And if you didn't, you were out. It gave the operation a kind of stability that few others could match. There were no constant betrayals, no sudden shootouts between rival crews. For a while, everything ran smooth. Lucas liked to compare it to a Fortune 500 company, only better, because he could trust the men running it. Family meant loyalty, and loyalty meant security. The house in Teaneck, New Jersey, became the center of this growing dynasty. On weekends, the driveway would be full of cars, the backyard filled with the smell of barbecue, children running and laughing while the men talked business over plates of food. For a moment, it almost felt wholesome, like a family gathering with nothing more sinister than talk about who was bringing dessert. Lucas liked these moments. They reminded him of why he was doing all of this, not just for himself, but to give his family the kind of life they had never dreamed was possible. But with family came risk. Blood could be trusted, yes, but blood could also make mistakes. Some of the younger cousins began to enjoy the money too much, flashing cash, buying cars they didn't need, showing up in places they shouldn't have been. Lucas tried to keep them in line, tried to remind them of the importance of staying low, of not drawing attention. But the bigger the operation grew, the harder it became to control every moving part. There were also tensions within the family itself. Power had a way of straining even the closest bonds. Arguments broke out over money, over territory, over decisions. Lucas kept a tight grip on things, but he could feel the undercurrents. It was like holding a lid down on a pot that was beginning to boil. And then there was the outside pressure. Other dealers were beginning to resent Lucas's near monopoly. The Italians were watching, wondering how this man from Harlem had managed to bypass them so completely. Corrupt cops wanted bigger payoffs. Everyone wanted a piece, and Lucas had to decide how much he was willing to give, and how far he was willing to go to protect what was his. Through it all, Lucas stayed calm. He had built this empire brick by brick, and he was not about to let it slip away. He doubled down on his rules, on his discipline, on his belief that family was the safest bet. If there was trouble, he handled it quietly, efficiently, the way Bumpy Johnson had taught him. But even Lucas could not see everything. He couldn't see that some of his own family members, despite their loyalty, would eventually become liabilities. He couldn't see that the very thing that had made his empire so strong, the fact that it was run by blood, would also make it vulnerable when the law finally came knocking. For now, though, the family empire was thriving. The money kept coming, the streets stayed orderly, and the name Blue Magic was stronger than ever. Lucas would sometimes sit in his backyard at night, a drink in hand, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of the city, and feel a kind of peace. He had done it. He had taken care of his people. He had built something lasting. But somewhere, in the back of his mind, there was always a shadow. He knew that power never lasted forever, that one wrong move could bring it all crashing down. And as the operation grew larger, as more and more people became involved, the chances of a wrong move grew with it. The family dinners, the laughter, the quiet pride, all of it would one day be tested. But that was still in the future. In this moment, Frank Lucas was a man at the head of a family dynasty, his empire running like clockwork, the money piling up faster than he could count it. The king of Harlem was secure on his throne. At least, for now. By the early 1970s, Frank Lucas had become something few men ever managed to be, a king in everything but name. His heroin empire stretched across Harlem and beyond, his network tight and efficient, his profits staggering. On any given day, money poured in by the hundreds of thousands, and by the end of a good week, Lucas was counting millions. In the quiet of his New Jersey home, he would sit at a kitchen table covered with stacks of cash, the air thick with the smell of money and cigarette smoke, and feel the weight of what he had built. The numbers were almost impossible to grasp. At his peak, Lucas claimed to have been making $1 million a day. Whether the exact figure was true or not hardly mattered, what mattered was that he was unquestionably rich, richer than almost anyone in Harlem's history. He owned multiple houses, drove luxury cars, and dressed in suits tailored so precisely they looked like they had been sewn onto his body. He had what he once could only dream about, control, respect, and the kind of wealth that could buy nearly anything. Yet Lucas was careful, at least outwardly, to avoid the kind of flamboyance that had destroyed others. He watched the flashy gangsters who paraded through Harlem, dripping in jewelry, drawing attention to themselves, and he reminded himself of Bumpy Johnson's lessons: stay calm, stay quiet, stay in control. For the most part, he lived by those rules, though there were exceptions. One of the most famous came when Lucas attended the Muhammad Ali-Joe Frazier fight at Madison Square Garden. He wore a full-length chinchilla coat with matching hat, a piece so extravagant it became legendary. The coat alone cost more than many houses, and it made him stand out in a sea of celebrities, politicians, and mobsters. For Lucas, it was a moment of pride, a way of telling the world that he had arrived. But later, he would look back on it as a mistake, one that drew exactly the kind of attention he had worked so hard to avoid. Because by this time, attention was dangerous. Lucas was no longer just another hustler, he was the man who had cornered the heroin market. And with that power came enemies. Rival dealers wanted him gone. The mafia wanted their cut. Corrupt cops wanted bribes. Even some of his own associates began to wonder just how far his reach really went. Lucas began to feel it, the pressure, the weight of being on top. He started to look over his shoulder more often. He noticed cars that seemed to follow him, men who lingered too long on corners, conversations that went quiet when he entered a room. He trusted his family, yes, but even then, he kept certain secrets to himself. Not everyone needed to know everything. At night, the mansion in Teaneck could feel strangely quiet, the laughter of the daytime barbecues replaced by a stillness that pressed in from the walls. Lucas would sometimes walk from room to room, listening to the sound of his own footsteps, thinking about how far he had come, and how far there was to fall. The paranoia wasn't just in his head. Law enforcement had started to notice the flood of high-grade heroin hitting the streets, and someone was asking questions. The DEA was getting involved. Investigators were starting to piece together the puzzle, slowly but surely working their way toward Lucas. But to the outside world, Lucas remained composed. He still moved through Harlem with the same quiet authority, his suit sharp, his hat brim low, his walk steady. People stepped aside when he passed. His dealers stayed loyal, his customers kept coming back, and the money kept flowing. This was the paradox of Frank Lucas's reign. He had never been more powerful, but he had also never been more vulnerable. Every dollar he made, every brick of heroin he moved, every connection he used brought him closer to the edge. He knew it, even if he didn't say it out loud. Sometimes, late at night, he would think back to Bumpy Johnson and wonder what his old mentor would say if he could see him now. Would he be proud? Or would he warn him that he was flying too close to the sun, that every empire has its breaking point? And somewhere, in the city, there was a man named Richie Roberts, an honest cop in a crooked system, who was beginning to take notice of the name Frank Lucas. Roberts wasn't like the others. He couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, and he was starting to build a case that would one day bring Lucas's empire crashing down. For now, though, Lucas remained at the top, his throne secure, his kingdom vast. The streets still buzzed with the name Blue Magic. The money was still coming in faster than he could count it. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city was still and the world seemed to hold its breath, Frank Lucas would sit alone and remind himself of the promise he made as a boy in North Carolina, that he would never be powerless again. But power, as he was beginning to realize, came with a price. While Frank Lucas was quietly building his empire in Harlem, another man was carving out a very different kind of reputation on the other side of the law. His name was Richie Roberts, and in a city drowning in corruption, he was a rarity, an honest cop. In the 1970s, the New York Police Department was riddled with dirty officers taking bribes from drug dealers, skimming money off busts, and turning a blind eye to whatever kept the cash flowing. Roberts, however, refused to play that game. He wasn't perfect, no cop was, but he had a reputation for doing things by the book, for staying clean even when temptation was everywhere. That made him unpopular with some of his fellow officers. In fact, it made him an outcast. But it also made him dangerous to men like Frank Lucas, even if Lucas didn't know his name yet. Roberts first came across Lucas's world by accident. He and his partner stumbled on a stash of cash during a raid, nearly $1 million in unmarked bills sitting in an apartment, waiting to be picked up. Most cops would have pocketed at least some of it, maybe all of it. No one would have known. But Roberts didn't take a dime. He logged every dollar, turned it all in, and walked away with nothing but the knowledge that he had done the right thing. That single act got him noticed, not by criminals, but by his superiors. Soon, Roberts was asked to join a special narcotics task force aimed at taking down the biggest drug operations in the city. For Roberts, it was a chance to do something that mattered, to fight back against the flood of heroin that was destroying neighborhoods, killing addicts, and filling the morgues with overdose victims. It wasn't long before the task force began to hear whispers about a new player in Harlem, someone who had cornered the heroin market, someone whose product was so pure it had earned a brand name, Blue Magic. This wasn't just another street crew. This was something bigger, something organized. Roberts began to dig. He started talking to informants, flipping low-level dealers, connecting dots. Each piece of information led to another, and slowly, the outline of Frank Lucas's empire began to take shape. Roberts didn't know Lucas personally, not yet, but he could feel his presence in the case file, in the money trails, in the stories told in hushed voices by men too scared to say the name out loud. The more Roberts learned, the more fascinated he became. Lucas wasn't like the others. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't reckless, and that made him harder to catch. He ran his operation like a business, kept violence to a minimum, and left very few loose ends. If Roberts wanted to bring him down, he would have to be just as disciplined, just as careful. And so the hunt began. Roberts assembled a small team of trusted men he knew he could count on to stay clean, to do the job right. Together, they began the painstaking process of following the money. They listened to wiretaps, tracked shipments, watched houses. Weeks turned into months. Leads dried up, new ones appeared, and slowly but surely, the noose began to tighten. Meanwhile, Lucas was still enjoying the peak of his power, largely unaware of the man who was now dedicating his life to bringing him down. But there were signs. Cars parked too long on the street. Faces he didn't recognize hanging around corners. A sense, almost instinctual, that someone was watching. Lucas began to adjust. He became more careful about who he spoke to, about how he moved his product. He trusted fewer people, kept meetings shorter, changed his routines. To him, it was just good business, the natural caution of a man who had survived this long by staying one step ahead. But to Roberts, it was proof that he was getting close enough that Lucas could feel it. What made the coming confrontation so compelling was how similar the two men were in certain ways. Both were disciplined, both were intelligent, both were relentless in pursuit of their goals. Lucas wanted control of Harlem. Roberts wanted justice. Or at least, something close to it. The collision between them was inevitable. By the time Roberts finally put a name to the man he was chasing, Lucas had become more than just a suspect. He had become the symbol of everything Roberts was fighting against, the heroin epidemic, the corruption, the decay of the neighborhoods. Taking him down wasn't just about one man. It was about proving that the system could still work, that honesty could still win in a city where almost everyone seemed to have a price. And so the stage was set. On one side, Frank Lucas, the quiet king of Harlem, running an empire with the precision of a CEO. On the other, Richie Roberts, the lone honest cop willing to risk his career, and his life, to bring him down. For now, the two men moved in separate worlds, circling each other without yet colliding. But soon, their paths would cross, and when they did, the game would change forever. The investigation against Frank Lucas was no longer just another case. By the early 1970s, it had become a full-scale operation, one that demanded constant surveillance, wiretaps, and patient detective work. Richie Roberts and his team began to live and breathe Lucas's world. They tracked him across Harlem, through New Jersey, even out of state, building a picture of his life one piece at a time. Surveillance was slow, painstaking work. The agents would sit in parked cars for hours, their coffee turning cold, binoculars fogging up, waiting for a glimpse of Lucas stepping out of his mansion or meeting with his lieutenants. They logged every movement, what time he left home, what car he drove, who he met, how long he stayed. The goal wasn't to catch him doing something obvious but to find patterns, to map out the web of connections that kept the heroin flowing. Wiretaps were placed on phones connected to Lucas's operation. Each day brought hours of recorded conversations, most of them mundane, talk about food, cars, the weather, but every now and then, there would be something useful. A mention of a shipment. A coded phrase that hinted at a deal. A voice that linked one part of the network to another. Bit by bit, Roberts and his team began to untangle the threads. Lucas, meanwhile, could feel the pressure building. He had always been careful, but now his caution turned into something closer to paranoia. He noticed cars that seemed to linger too long near his house. He spotted men who didn't look like they belonged on certain corners. He began changing his routines, never driving the same route twice in a row, holding meetings in new locations, using trusted runners instead of phones for sensitive messages. The mansion in Teaneck, once a place of family gatherings and quiet pride, became a fortress. Lucas kept visitors to a minimum. When meetings did happen, they were short, businesslike, and to the point. He wanted as little exposure as possible. Even family members were warned not to speak carelessly, not to flash money, not to draw attention. But no matter how careful he was, Lucas couldn't stop the feeling that someone was always watching. He would sit up late at night, the house quiet around him, and stare out the window into the darkness, wondering who might be out there with a camera or a notebook, waiting for him to slip up. The investigation, for its part, was growing stronger. Roberts's task force was pulling in more informants, flipping dealers who had been arrested and offering them deals in exchange for information. Each new name led to another, and soon, the entire distribution network was mapped out like a blueprint. It was a strange, almost invisible war being fought, one side gathering evidence in silence, the other side tightening security and trying to stay one step ahead. There were no shootouts, no public clashes. Just two forces circling each other in the dark, each waiting for the other to make a move. Lucas still projected calm when he was in public. He dressed as sharply as ever, still moved with quiet confidence through Harlem. But those closest to him could see the strain. He spoke less, kept his emotions buried, and trusted fewer people with sensitive information. He knew that his empire was too big to hide forever. The question was how long he could keep the law at bay, and whether he could find a way to protect what he had built before it was too late. The streets, too, were starting to whisper. Word spread that the feds were watching, that they were closing in. Some dealers grew nervous, started making mistakes, getting sloppy. Others became reckless, trying to make as much money as they could before the hammer fell. Lucas saw this and knew it was dangerous. One wrong move from one careless man could bring the entire organization down. And still, the money came. The shipments arrived, the bags were sold, the cash piled higher than ever. It was as if two realities existed at once, the thriving empire, still feeding Harlem's demand, and the looming threat of destruction, creeping closer with every day. Roberts and his team, for their part, began to sense that the case was reaching a tipping point. They had enough to know Lucas was running a massive operation, but they needed more, the big break, the piece of evidence that would make the case airtight. And they were willing to wait as long as it took. The tension was becoming unbearable. Lucas could feel it every time he stepped outside, every time he held a meeting, every time he saw a stranger's face linger too long. It was like living under a gathering storm, the air heavy, the sky darkening, the first rumble of thunder in the distance. And somewhere inside, Lucas must have known that the storm would not pass him by. It was early morning when the quiet broke. The air was still, the sky just beginning to pale with the first light of dawn, when Frank Lucas woke to the sound of something unusual, the distant thrum of helicopters. At first, it barely registered. But then came the pounding of fists on the front door, the shouting of voices, the sudden shatter of glass. In an instant, the mansion in Teaneck was alive with chaos. DEA agents, state police, and federal marshals swarmed the property, moving with military precision. Flashlights cut through the darkness, boots thudded across the lawn, radios crackled with clipped orders. The calm, controlled world that Lucas had built was being torn apart, piece by piece, right before his eyes. Lucas's family was jolted awake. Children cried, women screamed, men scrambled to see what was happening. Agents moved room to room, clearing spaces, shouting commands. Everyone on the floor, they barked, their weapons drawn, their faces grim. Frank Lucas stayed calm, or at least he tried to. He had always prided himself on his composure, on being the man who didn't panic, but even he could feel his heart pounding as he stepped into the hallway and saw the agents flooding his home. They moved past him, past the expensive furniture, the paintings on the walls, the life of wealth he had so carefully assembled. The search was thorough. Every drawer was opened, every closet emptied, every piece of furniture overturned if necessary. Agents found bundles of cash hidden in shoeboxes, in false compartments, under floorboards. Millions of dollars in drug money were pulled from the house that morning, more than most people would see in a lifetime. The sheer volume of it stunned even the agents. They stacked the bills in piles that grew so high they looked unreal, like something out of a movie. Out on the driveway, cars were being searched, trunks popped open, compartments ripped apart. Some of the vehicles were luxury imports, sleek and gleaming, a reminder of the fortune Lucas had made selling blue magic. Agents marked them for seizure. Everything was evidence now, everything a piece of the case they had spent years building. Inside, Lucas stood quietly, watching it all. He didn't resist. He didn't shout or fight. When they finally placed him in handcuffs, he remained composed, almost dignified, as though he had been expecting this day. Perhaps, in some corner of his mind, he had. No man could build an empire of this size and believe it would last forever. Neighbors stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold. Some whispered to each other, shocked that the quiet man from the big house down the road was at the center of such a storm. Others weren't surprised at all. They had heard the rumors, seen the expensive cars, suspected that no one could make that much money legally. By the time the sun was fully up, the raid was over. Lucas's mansion had been turned upside down. His fortune was in evidence bags, his cars lined up to be towed, his family in shock. The quiet king of Harlem was loaded into the back of a government car and driven away. For Richie Roberts, who had spent years chasing Lucas, it was a moment of quiet triumph. The work had been long, exhausting, often thankless, but now he had his man. The biggest heroin operation in New York had just been taken down, and one of the most powerful drug lords in America was in custody. But for Lucas, the arrest was just the beginning. He knew what was waiting for him: indictments, trials, prosecutors eager to make an example out of him. The newspapers would have a field day, splashing his name across headlines, turning him into a symbol of everything that was wrong with the drug trade. As the car drove away from the mansion, Lucas stared out the window at the streets passing by. He thought of Harlem, of the corners where blue magic had built his fortune, of the family he had brought north to run the business. It had all seemed so secure, so untouchable, and now it was gone, or at least, slipping away. The raid had done more than seize his money and his property. It had shattered the illusion of invincibility that Lucas had worked so hard to build. Everyone in Harlem would know now that Frank Lucas could bleed, that the man who had stood at the top of the drug trade could be taken down. Still, even in that moment, Lucas was thinking ahead. He had been in tight spots before, though never quite like this, and he knew that panicking would only make things worse. If there was a way to survive this, to keep some measure of control, to protect his family, to salvage what he could, he would find it. For the first time in years, though, Frank Lucas was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted, and the game had changed. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the benches, their notebooks ready, photographers waiting for a glimpse of the man whose name had dominated headlines for weeks. Outside, news vans lined the street, their antennas reaching into the sky, feeding live reports to an eager public. Everyone wanted to see the man they were calling the Heroin King of Harlem, the man who had built an empire in silence and brought the city to its knees with blue magic. Frank Lucas walked in wearing a crisp suit, calm as ever, his hands cuffed but his head held high. His face betrayed little emotion. This was not the street hustler who once ran errands for Bumpy Johnson, nor the driver who watched Harlem from the passenger seat. This was a man who had reached the top, been brought low, and was now facing the full weight of the law. The prosecutors laid out their case in meticulous detail. They spoke of international smuggling routes, of heroin so pure it rewrote the rules of the drug trade, of millions of dollars in profits. They introduced photographs of Lucas's mansion, of the cash seized during the raid, of the luxury cars, the fur coats, the evidence that painted a picture of excess and criminal genius. Witnesses testified. Former associates, low-level dealers, even corrupt police officers who had once taken bribes now stood on the stand, recounting what they knew. Piece by piece, the prosecution built the narrative, Frank Lucas wasn't just a drug dealer, he was an architect of an empire that had poisoned a generation. Lucas sat quietly through it all, his expression unreadable. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in a low, measured tone. But inside, he was calculating. He had always been a strategist, always looking for the angle, the way to turn a bad situation into an opportunity. His attorneys warned him of the stakes. If he fought and lost, he could face decades in prison, perhaps even life. The government wanted to make an example out of him, to show that no one, no matter how powerful, was beyond their reach. And so Lucas faced the most difficult decision of his life. One night, after a long day in court, he sat in his cell, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He thought about his family, his wife, his children, his brothers and cousins who had been swept up in the indictments. He thought about the years he might spend behind bars, the empire that was already gone, the money that would never come back. He thought about how everything he had built could disappear completely, leaving nothing behind but a name spoken in the past tense. In that silence, Lucas made a choice. He would cooperate. He would turn informant. It was a decision that sent shockwaves through the underworld. To turn on the system was one thing, to turn on your own, to help take down corrupt cops and rival dealers, was another. For some, it was unforgivable. Lucas knew that. He knew that once he made the deal, he would never be able to go back to the life he had known. But he also knew that it might be the only way to save himself and his family. By cooperating, he could reduce his sentence, protect his loved ones, and perhaps even keep a portion of his freedom intact. The cooperation was extensive. Lucas named names, not just street-level operators but high-ranking members of the police department who had been on his payroll. His testimony led to the arrest and conviction of more than 100 corrupt officers and dealers. It was one of the biggest takedowns of police corruption in New York's history, a purge that rocked the department and made headlines across the country. In the courtroom, the prosecutors painted Lucas as a man who had seen the error of his ways, who was helping to clean up the mess he had helped create. The defense argued for leniency, pointing out the magnitude of the corruption he had exposed. When the verdict came, Lucas was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, but far less than he might have faced without cooperation. For some, it was justice served. For others, it was a betrayal, a sign that the man who once prided himself on loyalty had turned on his own code. As Lucas was led out of the courtroom, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed. He didn't respond. He simply walked past them, head high, as if to say that whatever judgment they passed, he had made his choice and would live with it. But deep down, he must have known that the world outside those courthouse walls would never look at him the same way again. When the courtroom drama ended and the headlines began to fade, Frank Lucas disappeared, at least in the public eye. His cooperation with the government meant that he and his family were placed in the witness protection program, given new identities, new locations, and a chance, at least in theory, to start over. For a man who had once ruled Harlem, the transition was jarring. Gone were the tailored suits, the gleaming cars, the mansion in Teaneck filled with relatives and laughter. In their place came small, quiet houses in towns where no one knew his name. Lucas had traded power for anonymity, fortune for survival. At first, there was relief. The constant threat of arrest was gone, the risk of assassination reduced, though never fully eliminated. Lucas no longer had to watch his back every time he stepped out the door, no longer had to wonder which phone calls were being tapped or which faces in the crowd belonged to federal agents. But the quiet came with its own kind of weight. He had been a man used to constant motion, to decisions that shaped entire neighborhoods, to money arriving in endless waves. Now, the days stretched long and empty. He spent hours sitting at the kitchen table, staring out at streets that meant nothing to him, thinking about Harlem. About the life he had left behind. His family struggled too. They had been part of something powerful, part of an empire, and now they were just another family in hiding, living under assumed names, explaining to neighbors why they never spoke about where they came from. Some of the younger relatives bristled at the restrictions, the secrecy, the sudden loss of status. For them, it was as though they had been banished from a kingdom. Lucas tried to adjust. He took small jobs here and there, tried to keep busy, tried to build some semblance of normal life. But the quiet gnawed at him. He missed the streets, missed the sense of purpose that came from running an operation where every move mattered. And he missed the money. For all his wealth, most of it had been seized during the raid. What little remained had been hidden too well for even him to retrieve now. The days of counting stacks of cash that reached the ceiling were gone. He was, for the first time in decades, living like an ordinary man. At night, lying awake, Lucas would replay his life in his mind. He thought of La Grange, of the promise he had made as a boy never to be powerless again. He thought of Bumpy Johnson and the lessons he had learned in the passenger seat of that car, lessons about loyalty, discipline, control. He thought of the first time he saw blue magic hit the streets, the sense of triumph he felt watching the dealers marvel at its purity. Sometimes, he felt pride. He had built something extraordinary, something that had changed the game. He had outsmarted the mafia, outplayed the police for years, and created a fortune out of nothing but nerve and cunning. Few men could say that. But other times, the pride gave way to regret. He thought of the addicts who had lined up on Harlem's corners, the lives lost to overdoses, the families torn apart. He thought of the violence, the fear, the way power had slowly eaten away at the man he used to be. The phone would ring sometimes, a reminder that the world he had left behind was still out there. News of old associates being arrested, of rivals being killed, of new crews rising to take the place of the old. Harlem kept moving, with or without him. And always, there was the lingering fear. Witness protection could hide him, but it could not erase his past. There were still men out there who might see him as a traitor, who might be willing to settle old scores. Every time a strange car passed by the house, every time a knock came at the door, Lucas felt a flicker of that old tension. Years passed this way, the days blending together, the edges of his former life growing softer, like a photograph fading in the sun. Lucas aged, his face lined, his body slowing down, the years of stress and pressure catching up with him. He would give interviews later, speaking softly, almost wistfully, about those years in hiding. He described them as both a blessing and a curse, a second chance, but also a kind of exile. The quiet had saved his life, but it had also reminded him of everything he had lost. And yet, deep inside, the part of him that had once ruled Harlem never fully went away. The ambition, the hunger, the belief that he could outthink anyone, it was still there, waiting. And one day, that part of him would lead him back into trouble, even after all he had survived. For a time, the quiet life seemed to hold Frank Lucas in its grip. The years in witness protection gave him something he had never truly experienced, safety, if not peace. But for a man who had once run Harlem, who had commanded millions of dollars a day, there was something hollow about living in anonymity. The phone calls, the coded conversations, the meetings in back rooms, all of that was gone. In its place was silence, and silence could be suffocating. Lucas tried to adapt. He took small, legitimate jobs, tried to spend time with his children, tried to be a husband and father rather than a kingpin. But the adjustment was hard. He had spent most of his adult life surrounded by danger and excitement, making decisions that rippled across entire neighborhoods. Now, he found himself worrying about grocery bills and car repairs. For a man who had once counted cash until his hands ached, it was humbling, and not always in a way that felt good. Temptation eventually came knocking. It always does. The drug game was still thriving, and there were always people willing to offer Lucas a chance to make quick money. They came to him quietly, respectfully, reminding him of the man he used to be, offering him a taste of the power he had lost. At first, he resisted. He had done his time, made his deal, and he wanted to stay free. But as the months turned into years, the temptation became harder to ignore. Old habits stirred inside him, the thrill of making a move, the rush of seeing a plan come together, the satisfaction of proving he still had it. Eventually, Lucas stepped back into the game. It was smaller this time, less ambitious, more cautious, but it was still the game. And the game had changed. New players had risen, new crews were running the streets, and law enforcement was smarter, better funded, and far more aggressive than it had been during Lucas's prime. It didn't take long for him to get caught. In the early 1980s, Lucas was arrested again, this time for attempting to deal drugs while still under parole restrictions. The news made headlines. The once mighty Kingpin, who had brought down more than 100 corrupt cops with his testimony, was back in handcuffs. This time, there was no deal, no cooperation to bargain with. Lucas was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The quiet years were over. Prison was different now. Lucas was older, his health starting to decline, and the weight of his past pressed on him heavily. The days were long, the nights even longer. He spent hours thinking about the choices he had made, the empire he had built, and how quickly it had all slipped through his fingers. And yet, even in prison, Lucas retained a certain dignity. He kept to himself, avoided unnecessary trouble, and slowly began to accept the life he now lived. He read books, wrote letters, and tried to maintain a relationship with his children, though years of absence had strained those bonds. When Lucas was released in the early 1990s, he returned to a world that had changed even more than before. Harlem was different, the drug trade was different, and the respect he had once commanded was mostly gone. The younger generation knew his name, but only as a legend, a story told about the old days. Lucas tried to turn things around. He began speaking publicly about the dangers of the drug trade, warning young men not to follow the path he had taken. He worked with community leaders, gave interviews, and talked openly about his regrets. Some saw it as genuine redemption, a man trying to make amends for the harm he had caused. Others were more skeptical, wondering if he was simply trying to rewrite his own legacy. But there was no denying that Lucas had changed. Age had softened him, prison had humbled him, and the years had given him a kind of perspective he never had during his rise. He admitted that heroin had destroyed lives, that the fortune he had built had come at a terrible cost. In quieter moments, he still felt the pull of the past, the memory of the nights when Harlem hummed with energy, when his name meant power, when he could make a phone call and change everything. But he also knew that those days were gone, and that if he wanted to live out the rest of his life in peace, he had to leave them behind for good. It wasn't easy. Lucas was a man who had always thrived on control, on building, on moving forward. Now, his greatest challenge was simply staying still, staying out of trouble, staying alive, staying free. And so Frank Lucas entered the final act of his life, no longer a kingpin, no longer a fugitive, but a man trying to find a place in a world that had moved on without him. Harlem had changed by the time Frank Lucas stepped out of prison for the final time. The neighborhoods that once pulsed with the energy of his empire had been reshaped by decades of hardship, redevelopment, and shifting power. Some of the old brownstones had been abandoned, others renovated and sold to new residents who had never heard of blue magic. The Harlem of Lucas's youth, the smoky bars, the bustling corners, the nights that never seemed to end, was fading into history. And yet, his name remained. Whispered in barbershops, murmured on street corners, remembered by those who had lived through the 1970s. Frank Lucas had become more than a man, he was a story, a symbol of a time when Harlem's underworld had been both feared and strangely respected. For some, Lucas was almost a folk hero. They remembered the turkeys he handed out on Thanksgiving, the money he quietly gave to neighbors in need, the way he kept the streets relatively peaceful during his reign. When Frank was running things, one man said years later, you could walk down the block without worrying about getting shot. There was a kind of order to his empire, a strange stability that some people missed when newer, more chaotic crews took over in the decades after his fall. Others, however, remembered the darker side. They remembered the families destroyed by heroin, the addicts who wasted away on stoops, the funerals for young men who overdosed on blue magic. They saw Lucas not as a savior but as a man who had profited from misery, who had poured poison into the community and gotten rich while others died. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between those two extremes. Lucas himself admitted as much in later interviews. "I did what I did," he once said, his voice quiet, almost resigned. "I can't change that. But I can tell the truth about it." The truth was complicated. Lucas had been a visionary, yes, a man who changed the way the heroin trade worked, but he had also been ruthless, willing to flood the streets with a product so strong it became infamous. He had brought order, but at a cost. Harlem's memory of him became almost mythological. Young hustlers heard his name and saw a model to emulate, a blueprint for turning nothing into something. They admired his discipline, his ability to outsmart the mafia, his rise from a poor boy in North Carolina to a man who could sit ringside at the Ali Frazier fight in a chinchilla coat. But older voices often stepped in with a warning: look closer, and you'll see where that path leads: prison, betrayal, regret. Even the police had mixed feelings. On one hand, Lucas's cooperation had helped clean out an extraordinary level of corruption within the NYPD. More than 100 officers had been arrested thanks to the information he provided. On the other hand, he had embarrassed the department, revealed just how deep the rot had gone, and some officers never forgave him for it. In the years that followed, Lucas became a kind of reluctant public figure. Journalists sought him out for interviews, historians wanted his perspective, and documentary crews asked him to tell his story on camera. He usually obliged, speaking in a calm, reflective tone, his words carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much to romanticize the past. There was a melancholy quality to those conversations. Lucas rarely smiled when he talked about his empire. Instead, he spoke of the lessons learned, the mistakes made, the lives ruined. He never denied that he had been good at what he did, perhaps the best, but he also made it clear that the cost had been higher than even he had imagined. Harlem, in its own way, seemed to forgive him, or at least, to accept him as part of its history. Murals appeared with his face, sometimes alongside other figures of the Harlem underworld. His story was told in music, in books, in the whispered lore passed down from one generation to the next. But the debate never ended. Was Frank Lucas a necessary evil, a man who brought order to chaos, or was he simply another exploiter, someone who got rich while his own neighborhood paid the price? There were no easy answers, and perhaps that was why his story endured. It wasn't neat, it wasn't simple, it was human. And that complexity was what fascinated people most. Lucas had been feared, loved, hated, admired, sometimes all at once. He had been a gangster, a businessman, an informant, a father, a husband, a symbol. He had lived several lifetimes in one. Standing in Harlem in his later years, Lucas could look around and see a world that no longer belonged to him. The streets were quieter now, the corners different, the game changed. But somewhere in the cracks of the sidewalks, in the memories of those who had been there, a shadow of his reign still lingered. By the early 2000s, Frank Lucas had become something of a living legend. He was no longer the feared kingpin of Harlem, no longer the man quietly moving millions of dollars of heroin each week. Instead, he was an old man with a cane, his body slowing down, but his mind still sharp, still full of stories from an era that fascinated anyone who heard about it. And people wanted to hear those stories. Journalists sought him out first. They sat in his living room with tape recorders and cameras, asking him to explain how he had done it, how he had outsmarted the mafia, built a global heroin pipeline, and become one of the richest criminals in American history. Lucas was candid, even charming. He told them about the Golden Triangle, about hiding heroin in coffins and military planes, about the fortune he had once counted by hand. There was something magnetic about the way he spoke. He was neither boastful nor overly apologetic. He simply told the truth as he saw it, in a calm, matter-of-fact tone. "I was in the business to make money," he once said. "And I made a lot of it." Before long, filmmakers and writers took notice. Books were written about his life, some portraying him as a brilliant strategist, others as a dangerous criminal. Each added another layer to the legend, blurring the line between fact and myth. The most significant moment came in 2007, when Ridley Scott directed American Gangster, a film based loosely on Lucas's life. Denzel Washington played Lucas, bringing a quiet intensity to the role that captured both the power and the contradictions of the man. Russell Crowe played Richie Roberts, the detective whose dogged pursuit had brought Lucas down. The film was a critical and commercial success, introducing a whole new generation to the name Frank Lucas. For many viewers, this was their first encounter with his story, and it fascinated them. Here was a black man who had risen from the red dirt roads of North Carolina to outsmart the mafia and dominate one of the most lucrative drug trades in American history. But American Gangster was not without controversy. Some critics argued that it glorified Lucas, portraying him as a kind of anti-hero rather than a man whose empire had devastated countless lives. Others pointed out that the film took liberties with the truth, dramatizing events for cinematic effect. Lucas himself seemed to enjoy the attention. He attended the film's premiere, posed for photographs, gave interviews about the accuracy of the story. He laughed at some of the exaggerations but admitted that much of it was true. "Hollywood's gonna do what Hollywood's gonna do," he said with a shrug. The film sparked a renewed debate about Lucas's place in history. Was he a criminal mastermind to be feared? A visionary businessman who had changed the game? Or a cautionary tale about ambition and its price? Pop culture had a way of turning him into all three at once. Rappers name-dropped him in songs, comparing themselves to Frank Lucas as a way of claiming power and success. Documentaries were made, delving deeper into his life, exploring the realities behind the myth. Through it all, Lucas seemed to relish the chance to control his narrative. He gave interviews where he reflected on his choices, sometimes with pride, sometimes with regret. He spoke about the discipline it took to build his empire, the dangers he faced, the betrayals that haunted him. But he also made sure to emphasize the cost. "I hurt people," he admitted in one interview. "A lot of people. I can't take that back. But maybe by telling the story, someone else won't make the same mistakes." In this way, Lucas became both a storyteller and the subject of stories. He was no longer just a gangster, he was a character, a symbol, a piece of American history that fascinated audiences precisely because it was so complex. The pop culture spotlight brought him money, attention, and a kind of late-life redemption. But it also kept his past alive, ensuring that he could never truly escape it. Wherever he went, people recognized him, whispered his name, asked for autographs. He had gone from being hunted to being celebrated, an odd, almost surreal twist for a man who had once lived in fear of the law. For Harlem, the renewed interest in Lucas was bittersweet. Some residents felt pride that one of their own had become the subject of a Hollywood film, that his story had been told on such a grand stage. Others felt pain, remembering the damage his heroin had done and wondering why his life was being glamorized. And yet, the film, like Lucas's life, refused to fit into a simple box. It was neither pure celebration nor pure condemnation. It was, like him, a mix of light and shadow, triumph and tragedy. In the end, pop culture gave Frank Lucas something he had never quite had before, a legacy that reached beyond Harlem, beyond the drug trade, beyond the decades when he was either feared or forgotten. It turned him into an enduring figure, a name that would continue to be spoken long after he was gone. By the time Frank Lucas entered his final years, the sharp edges of his life had begun to smooth into something quieter, almost contemplative. The man who once strode through Harlem in custom suits, who once commanded a heroin empire worth millions, was now often seen in a wheelchair, his frame smaller, his movements slower. Time had done what neither the law nor his enemies could fully accomplish, it had humbled him. Lucas's health had begun to fail. Years of stress, prison, and the wear and tear of a life lived on the edge had taken their toll. He suffered from mobility issues, diabetes, and the aches and pains that come with age. Still, his mind remained sharp, and his voice carried that same calm, steady quality that had once commanded rooms full of hustlers and gangsters. He continued to give interviews, often from his living room, surrounded by photographs and mementos of a life that felt almost mythical now. Journalists would sit across from him, cameras rolling, and ask about the old days. Lucas would lean back, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes sighing, as if pulling those memories out of a locked room. He talked about the rise, the golden triangle, the shipments, the day blue magic hit the streets for the first time. He talked about the fall, the raid, the trial, the decision to cooperate with the government. But he also talked about the quiet moments, the barbecues in Teaneck, the pride he felt when his family gathered together, the rare nights when he allowed himself to just sit and enjoy what he had built. There was no bravado now, no need to prove himself. Lucas spoke with a kind of serenity, as if he had finally made peace with his own story. "I did what I did," he would say, his tone soft but unflinching. "I made choices. Some good, some bad. I paid for them. And I'm still here." He spent more time with his children and grandchildren, trying to pass on what wisdom he could. He warned them about the streets, about the temptation of easy money, about the cost of ambition when it runs unchecked. There was a gentleness in the way he spoke to them, a desire to protect them from repeating his mistakes. Yet even in those quiet years, the past was never far away. Lucas still had to live with the knowledge that many saw him as a villain, that his name still carried pain for families who had lost loved ones to heroin. He never denied that reality. If anything, he seemed to embrace it as part of who he was. The public fascination with his story never fully faded. Young people continued to seek him out, rappers mentioned him in songs, filmmakers and writers asked for his insights. Lucas had become both a teacher and a cautionary tale, someone who could speak about the cost of power with an authority few could match. Sometimes he would sit quietly after an interview, staring out a window, lost in thought. Perhaps he was remembering the first time he stepped onto a Harlem street as a young man from LaGrange, or the night he sat in a Bangkok hotel room planning a deal that would change his life. Perhaps he was thinking about the men who had stood beside him, some dead, some in prison, some forgotten. Age had slowed him, but it had also given him perspective. Lucas seemed to understand now that his life was neither pure triumph nor pure tragedy. It was both, a rise and a fall, a story of ambition, brilliance, mistakes, and survival. In the quiet of those last years, there was a dignity about him. He was no longer the man counting millions in cash, no longer the man dodging surveillance or plotting shipments. He was simply an old man looking back, trying to make sense of it all, trying to find some meaning in the path he had walked. And there was, perhaps, a measure of peace. Lucas had lived long enough to tell his own story, to see it written into books, turned into film, debated and remembered. He had lived long enough to see the myth and the man become almost inseparable. On certain days, when the weather was good, he would sit outside, feeling the sun on his face, and for a moment, the world seemed still. The noise, the chaos, the danger, all of it was behind him now. What remained was memory, and the knowledge that he had survived when so many had not. Frank Lucas passed away on May 30, 2019, at the age of 88. His death was quiet, almost gentle, a stark contrast to the turbulent life he had led. News of his passing spread quickly, first through local outlets and then across national media. Headlines appeared online and on television: Frank Lucas, notorious Harlem drug kingpin, dead at 88. For a brief moment, the world stopped to remember a man whose story had once shocked, fascinated, and divided an entire generation. In Harlem, the news carried a special weight. For those who had lived through the 1970s, Lucas was not just a name in the paper, he was a memory, a figure who had loomed large over their streets. Some people paused and nodded, murmuring that it was the end of an era. Others shook their heads, remembering the dark days of heroin addiction, the funerals, the devastation. Even in death, Lucas's name could summon both respect and anger. The tributes that followed were complex. Journalists revisited his life, recounting his rise from rural North Carolina to the top of Harlem's drug trade, his audacious Golden Triangle connection, the fortune he amassed, and the years he spent in prison and witness protection. Some articles focused on his business acumen, calling him a criminal genius. Others focused on the human cost of his empire, reminding readers of the thousands who had suffered because of the heroin he sold. Television programs replayed clips from his interviews, his soft voice carrying through the speakers as he reflected on his choices. There was something haunting about seeing him in those later years, sitting in his wheelchair, speaking not as a boastful gangster but as a man who had lived long enough to see the full weight of his actions. Family members released statements, remembering him as a father and grandfather, a man who had tried to make peace with his past. They spoke of his love for his children, his efforts to steer the younger generation away from the life that had consumed him. For them, he was not just the Kingpin, he was the man who sat at the table with them, who laughed at their jokes, who held their babies. The streets where Lucas had once held sway felt strangely still. His name had long since become part of Harlem's lore, but now that he was gone, it seemed to echo differently, not as a warning, not as a boast, but as a reminder of a time when the neighborhood was a different place entirely. Historians and cultural critics weighed in too, debating what Lucas's legacy really meant. Some argued that he should be remembered as a cautionary tale, proof of how ambition and greed can destroy not just one man but an entire community. Others argued that he was a product of his environment, a man who saw a system rigged against him and found a way to beat it, even if that victory came at a terrible cost. The debate played out on social media, where younger generations, many of whom had first learned about Lucas from the movie American Gangster, shared clips, quotes, and thoughts about what his life represented. Some admired him for his cunning, for outsmarting the mafia and law enforcement. Others criticized the tendency to romanticize a man whose product had destroyed lives. Through it all, one thing was clear: Frank Lucas had left a mark. His story had transcended the drug trade, had become part of American history, part of the mythology of New York City. He was a symbol of both possibility and peril, of how high a man could rise and how far he could fall. His funeral was attended by family, friends, and those who had known him during his reign. It was not extravagant, not the spectacle that some might have imagined, but it carried a quiet dignity. People stood up to speak, some telling stories of generosity, others speaking solemnly of lessons learned. The man who had once been the most powerful figure in Harlem's underworld was laid to rest with far more stillness than he had ever known in life. As the service ended and the mourners drifted away, the streets of Harlem continued as they always had. Cars passed, music played from open windows, children laughed and ran. Life went on, but there was a sense, for those who knew, that something had shifted, that a chapter had closed. Frank Lucas's death marked not just the end of one man's life, but the symbolic end of an era. The Harlem of the 1970s, with its jazz clubs, its hustlers, its quiet kingpin, was now firmly in the past. The city had changed, the game had changed, and the man who had once ruled it all had finally gone silent. Frank Lucas's story does not end simply with his death. The power of his life lies in what it continues to say about ambition, survival, and the cost of choices made under pressure. In many ways, his story is the story of America itself, a tale of poverty and opportunity, of daring innovation, of rise and fall, and of the endless tension between power and morality. When we look back at the arc of his life, we see a man who refused to accept the circumstances into which he was born. A poor boy from LaGrange, North Carolina, who watched violence claim someone he loved and swore that he would never be powerless again. That vow became the engine that drove him, taking him first to Harlem, then into the orbit of Bumpy Johnson, and eventually to the jungles of Southeast Asia, where he made the deal that would change everything. Lucas's genius was undeniable. He saw opportunities others missed, built a supply chain that bypassed the mafia, and turned heroin into a branded product with a reputation for purity that dominated the streets. He treated the drug trade like a corporation decades before the term corporate gangster entered popular culture. He was methodical, disciplined, and, for a time, untouchable. But every empire, no matter how carefully built, carries within it the seeds of its own collapse. Lucas's decision to trust only family created both strength and vulnerability. The very network that had made him so secure also made him visible to investigators once the net began to tighten. And in the end, no amount of discipline could stop the law from catching up with him. There is a temptation, when hearing Lucas's story, to focus only on the glamour, the money, the suits, the cars, the celebrity acquaintances, the nights at Madison Square Garden. But the truth is that his empire was built on a product that devastated Harlem, that claimed lives, that left scars still felt decades later. For every dollar counted in the Teaneck mansion, there was a mother burying her son, a sister mourning her brother, a family broken by addiction. Lucas himself seemed to understand this in his later years. When he spoke of his past, there was no celebration, only a calm acceptance. He acknowledged that he had hurt people, that the wealth he had built came at a terrible cost. And perhaps that is why his story is so compelling, because it does not offer a simple villain or a simple hero, but a man who was both brilliant and flawed, who made choices that changed his life and the lives of countless others. There are lessons here, for those who care to listen. Lessons about ambition, about how it can lift you up but also consume you if it runs unchecked. Lessons about loyalty, about how it can protect you, but also trap you. Lessons about power, about how intoxicating it feels to hold it, and how heavy it becomes when you realize that everyone is waiting for the moment you stumble. Perhaps the most important lesson of all is that there are no winners in a game built on destruction. Lucas won for a time, he outsmarted his rivals, he outmaneuvered the police, he became rich beyond his wildest dreams. And yet, in the end, he lost almost everything, his fortune, his freedom, his friends, his reputation. What remained was only the man himself, older, wiser, quieter, left to reflect on what it had all meant. And so, as we step back from his story, we are left with an image. Harlem at night. The streetlights glowing softly, the corners quiet, the shadows stretching long across the pavement. Somewhere in those shadows, you can almost imagine a younger Frank Lucas, standing tall, his hat low, his suit pressed, his eyes scanning the street like a man who already knows he is destined for something great. That image stays with you because it is both the beginning and the end. The boy who wanted more. The man who took it. The old king who finally sat in the quiet and looked back at it all. Frank Lucas's life was a symphony of ambition and consequence, of brilliance and regret. And as the story closes, as the last echoes fade, we are left not with the roar of helicopters or the clang of prison doors, but with silence. A silence that asks us to consider our own choices, our own ambitions, and the cost of chasing them to their end. In the stillness, you can almost hear the distant hum of Harlem, the faint notes of a saxophone somewhere down the block, playing a tune that feels both mournful and beautiful. The story is over now, but its echoes remain, reminding us that power, like life, is fleeting, and that every empire, no matter how mighty, must one day fall quiet.